Welcome to the Audiation in the Wild podcast with your hosts, Beau Taillefer and Eric Rasmussen. Season 3, Episode 9, Dr. Terry Bacon discusses his findings from renorming primary measures of music audiation. Well, good morning, Terry.
Good morning.
The one and only Terry Bacon. Describe yourself.
Describe myself. By day, I am a public school music teacher. I've been working in the same district for 25 years, I think. Something close to that. I spent 17 years as a high school band director teaching AP music theory. Eventually, we became an IB school, so I taught IB music for a couple of years. Then I took a transfer and spent 4 years just in time for COVID teaching K4 general music, beginning band, and fourth grade chorus. And when a position opened up for fifth grade band, only fifth grade band, I went and jumped to that because by night I am also a college teacher. I've been teaching at the University at Buffalo for 11, 12 years. And recently I started teaching undergraduates in an online class at Radford University in Virginia. So kind of a all over the place in terms of experience. I've done early childhood music all the way through college teaching, wind band conducting. My happy place is sitting in dark pits, conducting singers on stage, and a whole bunch of my friends playing for me down in the pits.
Cool.
How'd you get started in MLT now?
I didn't know any better. So my undergraduate degree is from the Eastman School of Music, and I still remember, I believe it was Monday night, my first music education class, Intro to Music Ed, was with Dick Grunow in a tiny, tiny little classroom in the back areas of the Eastman Theater. Music Ed has since moved to bigger digs, but they were kind of tucked behind the Eastman Theater, and so ended up spending 4 years studying with Dick Grunow, and Chris Azera was actually working on his PhD at the same time. So it was through the two of them that I got to meet Ed Gordon and send me down this path of music learning theory. Did my master's at Michigan State with Cindy Taggart, and then ended up just finally after 11 and a half years. I don't recommend doing a PhD over 11 and a half years. Pare it down and get it done. But my dear advisor, Dr. Maria Runfola, I needed to listen to her more often of keep focused and get it done.
Yeah.
Indeed. So you finished your PhD, Dr. Bacon.
Yes.
What was your dissertation? And now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of all things PMMA.
Yes, very much so.
And ancillary topics.
So I'll back up a little bit. A little one of those things that I feel like I'm part of finishing the story or continuing the story. PMMA was developed while Dr. Gordon was actually an instructor at the University at Buffalo, and Dr. Runfola was there for a lot of that research that he did with his taxonomies, what eventually became the taxonomies of tonal patterns and rhythm patterns. She was responsible for being the teacher going in that was administering the pattern tests that he was doing to develop those taxonomies. And she shared that what Dr. Gordon used to do was, had the file drawer of ideas of things that he was interested in. And so when his doctoral students was looking for something, open the file drawer. So she had known of me, and knew that I'm a bit of a tech head. I enjoy playing in numbers, and said, you know what? We really need to renorm the PMMA. And that was kind of the first idea when I started the doctorate at the beginning of the 11 and a half year journey. And then nothing ever better kind of came up of, you know what, I have the interest in learning more about PMMA. I have the computer number crunching skills. Hey, here's a crazy idea. Let's try to get a national sample and do what Ed told us not to, and attempt to renorm the PMMA using a national sample of students. And so that's what I attempted to do.
Cool.
Interesting. So, just out of curiosity, why? Could you unpack that a little bit? Why did Gordon say not to do that?
He had really good reasons, and it's one of those where, as often as I read the PMMA IMMA manual, because after he did the IMMA, then they both got published as the same thing. There's a little paragraph hidden in there where he gives his reasons that it's not practical. It's going to be a lot of work. It's probably not gonna find much in the way of differences from using a smaller sample, in that there's no national music curriculum. So there's going to be so many variables outside of what you can control. If you want to, go for it, but probably not. It's not going to make the best sense. And I had forgotten about that paragraph until I was, had finished the study, and of course was digging in and trying to do all the last bits of writing I'm ready for Eric. 'Cause, I know he's going to ask me hard questions, so I have the dissertation in hand so I can quick look up the cheat notes. But it was really hysterical going back and I should have listened.
So why don't you start walking us through your findings? What did you find that was interesting and noteworthy?
So I ended up, I guess the biggest noteworthy thing is the original sample was actually collected, and I guess this is another part where I feel like I was well placed, in West Irondequoit, New York. And so the standardization table that we know and love that's in the manual was developed as I'm facing the camera talking to you gents, about 20 minutes away from me, kind of straight ahead to the way I'm looking right now. And so I ended up originally having 18 teachers and they were all GIML members, from all over the country. I was trying to get at least representatives of every active GIML chapter. One site had to drop out due to the administration going, no, we don't want to do this. And then another site just kind of, the teacher disappeared, stopped responding to things. So out of those 16 sites, I had over 3,300 students in my sample.
Wow. And
I believe Dr. Gordon only had 871. The part that makes me giggle is I'm trying to, going from memory, I think I had 873 kindergartners in my K123 sample.
Nice.
So lots and lots of data. Again, if you're looking to do this for IMMA, because somebody needs to replicate this with IMMA and see if they can find something similar, that ended up being over 1/3 ones and zeros in a gigantic Excel spreadsheet to capture all 40 tonal test items, all 40 rhythm test items, and whether each kid got it right or wrong. Thankfully, to those 16 teachers who many of them scored the tests for me. Of course, we kept all the student data private. So the interesting things that I found, I had 5 questions. The first question was to just flat out create a new norms table. And again, I want to stress that because it was a dissertation, we decided to simply replicate what Dr. Gordon did, which is good for me because, again, Dr. Runfola, pare it down and get it done. My statistics chops are that of a, high school, middle school band director. So I can run an Excel sheet pretty well. And the cool thing is this Excel could do most of the stuff that Maria would talk about, the giant piles of punch cards and having to make sure you didn't accidentally dump the punch cards over so that you could send them through the computer in 1978 to generate all of this. And now it's just, all of my teachers filled out all the demographic data for their students on provided Excel spreadsheets. So after crunching all those numbers, all those ones and zeros, my norms tables, kind of looking at them, eyeballing them, are pretty much the same. There's really not a whole lot of difference. And a lot of suspect that these were almost 50-year-old norms. We're going to find something different in the tables. So that was kind of like, darn, did all this stuff, and is when you start looking at the kindergarten where the 20th percentile, the 50th percentile, and the 80th percentiles kind of kick out. Raw score wise, they're right in that ballpark, maybe 1 or 2 points difference. Second question, though, was the one where I started getting really interested in, and that was calculating the item difficulty and item discrimination.
Yeah.
And item difficulty is, how hard was the question?
Easy.
How easy, how hard, and then discrimination is how well does that item perform when you compare the high scoring kids versus the lower scoring kids. So if you're not statistics minded, the easy way of thinking of it is item difficulty. Simply it's a percentage, right? All right, 88, it's 0.88, but that means 88% of the kids got it right. So if you get a lot of high numbers, that means you had a lot of easy questions. When you're looking at the difficulty, you want to try to keep things challenging enough, not being too challenging. For Gordon's test design, for any good test design that I've learned through this journey, you want a nice mix. You want a couple of easy questions that are going to keep the test taker interested. Then you're going to need some of those harder questions that are going to separate, your 96th percentile, 97th percentile, where that's going to fall. Generally, you absolutely do not want a negative number when you calculate that, because that means more of the kids that scored badly in terms of how they did on the test got that question right compared to the number of kids in the higher scoring group. You would expect the higher scoring kid, so as soon as you start seeing negative numbers, standard test theory says that question's got to go. And what ended up we found is that in many cases, I was getting a lot of high difficulty scores, and I got a lot of low, very low, below 0.2. And that was what Gordon set as kind of like his determination of whether an item was going to be used in the test or not was like 0.2. And so I had a lot of numbers below 0.2, and I had at least one item in all 4 grades, kindergarten, first, second, and third grade, that ended up being negative. So that's kind of the meat of where I started scratching my head. Like, this is starting to show that. And
quick question: were you seeing these effects within more so the tonal test or both?
All over. Yeah. And my suspect going in, based on just anecdotal conversations with folks, is that we were going to find interesting stuff for rhythm, and it really it made me appreciate Dr. Gordon's test design, that he was trying to find items that could be used in a test kindergarten through third grade. And the other thing too is that this really kicked out, those things that you read, and then you do a study like this and you realize, man, the man was right. He basically made the IMMA, the intermediate measures of music audiation, because he started finding that people who were teaching using his ideas, the PMMA was too easy. And so I think I may have gotten myself in trouble, because all 16 sites, the teachers that participated in my study, are all GIML members. I would suppose that they are all using Gordon's ideas. So at the end of the day, my conclusions when I, looking at my first 2 questions of how do the norms tables compare and where do item difficulties and discriminations come out, basically, second and third grade, the test was too easy for my sample of students. For kindergarten, that turned into a hot mess. A lot of it was the informal. I gave all the teachers a questionnaire. Just what happened? What'd you do? Did you make any kind of modifications? Did you, like, some open-ended questions? And then, like, what else do you want to tell me? And it was teacher after teacher going, get rid of the knife as one of the icons. Because that causes a lot of problems with students here, at least in the United States. They'd say knife, it's a knife. And the other thing was, this is just brutal. Trying to give this test to kindergartners is just, there's more fun things to do on a Saturday than that kind of thing. Or
so we haven't released, we recorded an episode recently about MAP, and we haven't released it yet. But one of my questions was, is the test still valid if you give it in smaller increments, like 5 questions at a time over the course of 6 weeks or whatever? Because I've noticed the same thing. I just don't want to subject students in a one-on-one lesson to 40, tonal questions at once. But right. I've never read anything about whether that disturbs the validity of the answers that people give, because there's been some talk about maybe fatigue being part of the test. When someone does 40 questions in a row after 30 questions, does fatigue play a role in what we're measuring in terms of just the onslaught of questions? Because a kid with high aptitude, supposedly around 30 questions, and they've crushed all the questions, is not feeling as much fatigue as someone else who's struggling with the questions.
Correct.
And so
and that also brings up
that's just a point.
So you've got me going in 2 directions, because you met two great points with my findings. Point number 1 was the student or the teachers really noting the fatigue, and also part of my delay was this global pandemic happened, so I needed kids in classrooms to actually take the test, and so a lot of the questions that the teachers were asking out loud was, or observations was, the kids reacted differently. They were hard pressed to say what was different other than the fatigue, the number of meltdowns that they noticed while they were administering the test, that the nature of the class was not the same as the administrations before COVID. The other point is then my other 3 questions. My other 3 questions, because I had collected all of this demographic data, I asked the teachers to identify male, female, and I do want to acknowledge that I understand that gender is, we're having questions of gender, but at least around the world, or around the world, the United States, the male, female, we could all agree on and not get into any kind of political discourse. And especially with that's how their parents are identifying them in the management systems that we have. My second question was to compare scores for any English language learners. And the third question was to compare scores of students that were identified with either IEP or a 504. And that was simply just, they have an IEP or a 504 or they didn't. And then the ELL question was either they're an English language learner or not. And of course, huge percentage differences between ELL and nothing, not ELL, and IEP 504 and not IEP 504. So when it came to the gender question, something very, very weird happened, and it was second grade girls. Oh, shoot, I should know this by now. I believe it was tonal. Ended up being significantly different. And that was it. There was no significant differences for anything else. And it just seemed odd, like it was a fluke in the data. The effect size was small. And so I ended up having to, my conclusion say, yeah, there's Gordon's proposal that there's no differences for gender seems to be true. But then he stated that there shouldn't be any differences for ELL. There shouldn't be any differences for students with that may need extra supports, and that's not what I found. Those students, ELL students, did significantly worse in almost all areas, and the 504 IEPs did do significantly worse. Sorry,
could you unpack 504 IEP?
So a 504 IEP, Individualized Education Plan. So if a student needs added supports for whatever either mental or physical disabilities they may have, if IEP is written by a committee, and as educators, we are all responsible for following whatever that IEP says. 504 is almost a preliminary step to that. In many cases, 504 504s end up being more behavioral issues, but also a student that may be struggling in some specific ways might be given a 504 rather than having a full IEP written, because IEPs are, written by committee. They have to be every year revised by committee. They are a legal document that we as educators are responsible for following. And quite often for both 504s and IEPs, it's going to say that a student needs extended time, either time and a half, double time. They may need to be tested in a alternative location. They might need to be one-on-one. They might need a scribe. They might need somebody to actually mark for them. There was one test that we decided to throw out because the teacher just noted, like, yep, I have just pulled this kid's, because the scribe was actually just answering the questions for the kid. So we were getting the music aptitude answers for the adult rather than for the student.
Yeah.
What percentage were pattern marked?
That's a really good question, and that became quite the what am I going to do? Because, if you've ever given the test and you've read the manuals, Gordon warns that we need to look for pattern marking. As a teacher, I do not have, it's funny, I did this study on PMMA, but I've given IMMA way more than any of the other of Gordon's tests, even including AMMA and my trying to give people experiences of what his tests are like as Gibble faculty. But we elected to go PMMA first, and so I'm looking at these papers and thinking, man, this is obviously pattern marked, but maybe it isn't. And the hard ones were where the kids seemed like they did patterns for 90%, but then there might be 10 or 50 as you're looking at this sheet, and so ultimately, I elected to include all test papers as they were presented to me by the teacher. There was only a couple of cases where the teacher said, yeah, no, this was... The kid got pulled. So I ended up having to decide how I was going to treat the missing data. And missing data and treatment of missing data seems to be, in my growing and learning as a researcher, a relatively new concern. And so as far as, I'm not going to accuse Dr. Gordon of doing anything. He probably did what any researcher in the 70s would have done, is like, all right, well, this kid missed the tonal test. They're gone. We're going to toss them out of the study. I don't have complete data for the tonal and the rhythm from a student, or they may have gotten pulled out. I'm just going to pull them out. So there's probably in my findings, there's going to be that variability of, there's a number of sheets that were very obviously pattern marked, but I couldn't decide, was it or was it not? Especially when you go back and I forget if it's the first or the second of Gordon's original 3 pattern studies. All of the answers were same. So
yeah, so I remember when I first encountered that, just doing a double take. But hopefully that's where your sample size really comes to the rescue, where even if there is 50 students which seems like a high amount, but maybe not, over 3,000 kids.
Right.
So, I mean, there's some strength in that.
And ultimately, that's what saved me. One of the members of my committee is an absolute statistics genius, thank goodness. And she was able to help me and guide me through this. And she's like, okay, wait a minute. How many kids are we talking about that either missed the tonal test or the rhythm test in terms of just completely pulling them out of the study? And it ended up being way less than 10%. The 10% was kind of like, that's the magic cutoff to determine whether or not, it's like, nope. So at the end of the day, I still had well over 3,000 students in the study. The fun part was getting the test retest. That's where I ran into some IRB issues. I would have had to have all of the teachers actually do all of the IRB training and all of that. And so we ended up using 2 teachers that had recently completed IRB training, still had IRB credentials, and so they were very generous in doing the retest, which was forcing those kids 2 weeks later to sit down and do it again.
What was the reliability there?
Everything. It was so disappointing to go, yep, same as Gordon, pretty darn close. Pretty, It's like thing after thing after thing. It really was only until I got to diving into my second question on the difficulty and discrimination that I could start going, yes, I may have actually found something.
Yeah, I'm curious whether keeping those kids that, didn't have, because I was brought up by Gordon.
Correct.
And then followed up by Beth Bolton, who stuck very close to Gordon in terms of measurement, evaluation, and all these calculation of descriptive statistics. And in all of my administrations, I would throw out the padding marking or throw out somebody that didn't have both subtests complete. And so I just doing what I was told at that point until I learned a little bit more how you can still get a lot of good data by not throwing out kids. Just because they skipped a question, Beth Bolton would say, throw it out. That's my memory. Maybe not, but that might throw some of your discrimination values for a loop.
Yeah.
By doing that because Gordon didn't do that. Maybe.
Now,
I don't.
You bringing up Dr. Bolton reminded me, the other point, Beau, that I going back, in my conclusions, one of the things I realized is that buried in that beginning part, and it's like I always look for the manual because it used to just be at my right hand for the last 4 years. He buries a lot of suggestions for how to modify the test. And because that manual is so dense with all of the extra Gordon stuff that we've come to know and love, but when it comes to just the practical bits of how to administer the test, you kind of got to dig in there and read some of that. And he suggests, hey, the kids are getting tired, give them a break. If they need to lay down on the floor, give them a surface that they can lay down on the floor on. And a lot of the more successful feedback that I got from teachers, and which then leads back to Dr. Bolton's dissertation, which was looking at what kinds of things to prepare the students before the test. Gordon said you shouldn't have to do that. But what is same? What is different? I know that later on, I believe he said he should have used same and not same in the description. One of the easiest things you can do is change the script to say same and not same. Because
I don't know, Terry, if you've listened to our podcast, but we bring up Siegfried Engelmann a lot.
Okay.
And he found the same thing when he was teaching really young, pre-K and kindergarten students, just general, education. He was trying to teach generalization of math concepts, of reading concepts, and he landed on the fact that you need to use the vocabulary of same and not same.
That totally makes sense. And I seem to remember from Dr. Bolton's description some of the things that she was investigating. A lot of my more successful teachers were doing that. My favorite one that I had to tone down in my defense, but I was last summer asked to kind of do a 4-hour Gimmel workshop and kind of talk about aptitude testing. And because it was not my official defense, I could get out the stuffed animals. But one teacher said, oh yeah, for years, she's been throughout the test having 2 stuffed animals to say, here's stuffy number 1 for when it was the first. And then she would hold up stuffy number 2 for second to help keep the kids focused, to help them once they're on to question 30, 35, getting close to the end of the test where they're getting distracted. The other thing
that was one of my concerns with not just age ranges, but just focus issues. Because I could see a lot of kids who potentially have high enough aptitude to answer the questions, but their focus is not just being harnessed where it needs to be when they're given the question, and they just throw out an answer.
And what about
students?
I was going to say, what about students with processing delays?
Oh, exactly. Yeah,
I have a student that I started on, I believe. So, anonymous, I started in 4th grade, and, he picked the same instrument as me, and had a marvelous tone. But man, getting him to be able to get his fingers to go, and, especially once we got to notation, I mean, he's a half a beat behind everybody else. Marvelous young musician, but you can really it's personal to me because for the rest of my career, when I think about processing delays, that challenge of he knows the music that he wants to make, but gosh darn it, his the way his brain is wired and what he can make his fingers do just needs a little more time.
I've seen that too. A student of mine, one of my students comes to mind. He's a great audiator, great ability to generalize. He can sing back patterns, but on the instrument, if I play something, bum 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 bum, he'll often literally play the exact opposite thing, bum 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 bum, and it's almost like it's like an instrumental association dyslexia. Like it's the weirdest thing. Or with tonal patterns, if I go bum, 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 and ask him to play it on the piano, he can sing the right pattern, but he'll often play bum, bum, bum on the piano. And it's remarkable. And it's taken years to, it's really, what's interesting is he's always playing with the right patterns though. The patterns always get inverted, whether they're stepwise, they'll be played backwards, or they're tonal patterns, they'll be played upside down sometimes. And just exploring this with him over the past few years, he really doesn't have this issue much, but I could see how if someone wasn't very gentle with how they're pushing on this, it could really frustrate him because he can audiate the right thing. It's just putting it on the instrument. His motor system seems to flip things around. But it was fascinating to see. I don't have much background in, processing. I don't even know if that is classified as a processing thing, but to me, it almost feels like a muscular motor learning, like dyslexia when it's linked to his audiation. It's very fascinating actually, because I see it at higher levels sometimes, and you don't really think anything of it. But when it's at very simple patterns that he can audiate very well and sing back no problem, that's just been a fascinating experience as a teacher to notice that. Because talking to his mom, I remember asking his parents in the first year of lessons, because he was a great audiator from the beginning. He could spit back tonal patterns, pretty much as soon as he started lessons with me. And he has, writing issues with so I don't know if there's something related to the two, but there's something about his mind taking either music or words, like English words in his mind, and putting them down with his hands. Something isn't communicated properly in his mind.
Yeah. And that, I think really that leads to, research begets more questions, I think, than you go in. And that was a lot of the pondering I was having. Okay, I just said, did the student have a 504 or IEP? But there is a whole vast range of things that may cause a student to have a 504 or an IEP. And they all need to be researched. They all need to be looked at. We know completely. So much more, and we're learning so much more than when Gordon originally designed these tests. Do
you think that back then there's the same diversity, but we didn't know? Or do you think that the diversity has augmented now?
I honestly don't know. That was one of the questions, though, was like, one of those, when did IEPs become a thing? When did the Students with Disabilities Act actually? And that was about the same time as when Dr. Gordon was designing these tests. So it may have been a couple of years before he wrote, created, researched PMMA. How much of what was now being mandated for schools had actually happened? Because we know, they sit in government and they go, okay, we should do this. And then it's up to the teachers and district administrators to figure out, okay, but how?
20 years later, it starts being implemented at a common level. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. As part of my tech teaching, I enjoy having my students go back at the very end of the semester, my college students now, speaking as Dr. Bacon, that I like them to go back and look at the original opportunity to learn technology standards from the music standards from the early 90s. And it's hysterical to read the high level of stuff that was considered required for a quality music classroom. And I'm thinking, we don't even have that today. So I have them kind of, last class, look at today's and then look at these from the 90s and then think about your experience through as teachers and coming up through public education. How much of this stuff did you actually have in your rooms?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's, I guess, coming back to thinking about the tests. One of the questions that I have is really starting to look at IMMA. It really, to me, seemed like Dr. Gordon. And MAP was not my area of research. And if you're really interested in kind of checking some stuff out, I would absolutely look at Berta Yee's dissertation. She was right ahead of me, finishing her PhD at UB, and she was very fortunate to have a lot of longitudinal data using a variety of Gordon's tests. But using her dissertation and what of MAP I included in mind, it really seemed like Dr. Gordon crossed all his T's and dotted all his I's when he designed MAP. It seemed like for PMMA, he had his taxonomies that he had developed at UB. He started creating PMMA. It was finished about the time that he moved from UB down to Temple. So it seemed like good research design was utilized for PMMA. And I just have this feeling with what was reported and what I was looking at that same rigor didn't necessarily happen for IMMA. And I think the questions that I had about PMMA going in are even more vital for IMMA, because so many of us, even people, it seems to me, that don't use Gordon's tests for any other purpose other than for instrumental recruitment, because they had somebody along the line that said, hey, you should use this and use these scores to help guide your instrumental recruitment. So I know there was a lot of people when I first did the call for PMMA, I was like, I don't give that, because who wants to teach kindergarten, or who wants to test kindergartners? So since PMMA is first grade, or IMMA, sorry, it starts first grade, I just use IMMA all the way through. And so I'd be really, really curious to see what would be found if somebody just simply did what I did. Get a giant, large sample of students and give them IMMA and see if the norms are the same, but see if something similar might be found for the item difficulties and discriminations. And then, of course, taking some really smart people in statistics and using modern statistical techniques, all the fun things we can do with SPSS now, that was outside of the pare it down and get it done philosophy of proving that I could do research and finish this doctorate thing.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
What comes up with you? Now, this is going to turn subjective validity regarding the taxonomy of patterns that were used in the tonal tests of PMMA, IMMA. What when you look at the two tests, just the tonal patterns, what comes up for you in terms of the taxonomy from which those patterns were drawn? Well,
I know that you had mentioned that was something that you were interested in, so I went back and kind of was skimming my dissertation this morning, just trying to remember. So I think it comes down to the conclusions of others, and it's where I think I've fallen on this, and there's no, I don't have solid research backing for this, other than to say Dr. Gordon was a classically trained bass player, Western classical traditions, Western jazz style traditions. So those original classifications were done based on him. I remember Carol Gordon sharing one of the many times that Ed was up in Buffalo, and Dr. Runfola would be kind enough to open up her home, and people that were involved in the caretaking of Dr. Gordon while he was teaching would be invited for a magnificent dinner. And Dr. Runfola, I still, I owe her so much. And one of the little secrets is, she's a brilliant researcher, brilliant person, but man, can she cook. Oh, delicious. But anyhow, so we were at one of these meals, and Carol shared the stories of when Gordon was coming up with these taxonomies. And all I could think of was the movie A Beautiful Mind, when he started doing the mathematical formulas on the window. Yeah. He all of these little patterns he'd be writing on pieces of paper and then sticking them to every flat surface. So she said their entire apartment in Buffalo was covered in nothing but these patterns that he was trying to organize based on his experience as a Western classically trained musician and jazz bassist. So I think we would have to try to create a taxonomy for other musical traditions. Having said that, and having looked at what he did and tried to wrap my brain around how he developed and tested these taxonomies, I don't think you can actually ever replicate that research. I think it would be very, very, very challenging for someone to replicate that research.
Yeah, I don't know how he did it. You just get millions
brutal.
of kids.
Brutal. The last study, when he was attempting to really lock in what these taxonomy of tonal patterns and his taxonomy of rhythm patterns was going to be, involved testing the same kids over and over again. And I can't imagine taking that much time from the musical guidance of these kids to just keep administering the same beep boops done by the Moog synthesizer in different orders and different pairings and different combinations, because it was found that as part of design of the test that sometimes this pattern plus this pattern made it easier, or all right, if we swap the pattern out, how does that change the items difficulty discrimination calculations. It's reading those three studies is difficult. They're sitting behind me on the floor in all of the books that eventually someday I need to return to the UB library. But I just had to keep rereading passages of, wait a minute. So the kids had presented in this order, and then a couple weeks later they did the same test, but it was in the backwards order, and these other kids started with the backwards order and what? And I know from Dr. Runfola, because she was the music teacher that was going in to supervise the testing. She said that those kids just did not like her. They saw her, and there were visceral reactions. And this is in the 70s. As a child that grew up and would have been, that work was done over around the Buffalo area. But I grew up in Rochester, New York. I was, the age that Dr. Gordon would have been testing those kids. And I remember we don't have nearly the tests that our kids have to take today. The timing of that we're recording this, it's state testing season here in New York. I'm not going to be doing much work as a music teacher this week because it's the ELA test. And then in 2 weeks, it's going to be the math test. And in 2 weeks, it's going to be the science test. Hours and hours and hours of my Wednesdays and my Thursdays are going to be spent helping kids go to the bathroom and watching kids take tests on their computers. So to go in this high stakes testing culture that we now have, at least here in the United States, to do any kind of research where you'd be having to give up that much instructional time is just such a challenge. Like
I think this is where other possible designs could really come in handy for doing research, because if we're constantly seeing, like even me, like someone who's never done research, I've just administered some aptitude tests to students and watched them take it and seen the fatigue and seen the cognitive, just struggle involved in that. I mean, my first thought is, why don't we make the tests way shorter and just administer them more often for longer periods of time? Because I would assume that taking 2 to 4 questions every single week for a year, rather doing 40 questions, or I don't know what the volume of testing.
Let me address that, because I've had the two bits of information for what it's worth. So among the studies, and it seemed like this because Dr. Runfolo was so involved in the early development of PMMA, and then where Ed just said, okay, we'll take the stuff that I rejected from PMMA because it was too hard, and we'll make another test that it's a harder version of PMMA. So there were a number of dissertations under Dr. Runfolo's supervision that have been done on Dr. Gordon's aptitude tests. And I'm forgetting which one it was, but the researcher was looking at trying to develop a new test. I believe it was for Chinese students. And she got to work with Dr. Gordon, and he was adamant that you need, for statistical oomph, you need those 40 questions. Because she was trying to figure out a way of designing a shorter test. And I need somebody smarter that can talk to me about AMMA.
So what about 40 questions within 4 weeks, though, rather than 40 questions within 1 hour?
Then there's the second point of that. It was because of the research on MAP to try to develop MAP for younger students. And if you look at the history of music aptitude testing, it's really easy. Gordon wrote a book on it. So it was really hard to do a lit review, because the most thorough critique of the historical music aptitude tests was done by Dr. Gordon himself. And a lot of those researchers were questioning weirdness was happening around age 9, age 10. And that's kind of what Dr. Gordon and his doctoral students were finding. One of, I believe it was DeYarman, actually went against Gordon and said, you know what, it seems like maybe rhythm aptitude stabilizes around 2nd grade. And that's, again, I want to give credit to Dr. Yee in her dissertation, is she has the data to back that up. That it seemed like, and of course, more research is needed, that rhythm aptitude may be stabilizing before tonal aptitude. But coming to your point, if we are taking the snapshot of what's going to be a reliable aptitude test and it's in developmental aptitude, then you're not going to...
That's my concern too.
It's going to change. If it's stabilized, then maybe.
But how much can it really develop over the course of 1 to 2 weeks? If you were to give someone 2 questions a day, 5 days a week for 2 weeks, I mean, we're getting in the realm of, we're starting to build questions. You could change the design, 3 questions a day, 5 days a week, till you get 40 questions. I mean, if it was standardized, if that was the standardized process across students, I'm just playing around with ideas that would allow us to do more testing without frustrating students. Because basically, if we're, or even with technology, I could imagine technology in the future playing a role in gathering data here on presenting questions like that to students and having them answer and collect the data.
And that was actually one of the questions early on that was thought of, well, do I make my study add a layer, because there are online versions of PMMA and IMMA, and I elected to not do that. Let's just keep it simple, the pencil and paper. And from practical experience, I know of some folks that have tried using the online, and they're just not happy with it. They just don't feel that the way it functions, that they're getting they're getting the same quality of data at the end. But somebody needs to research that, because that's just their gut feeling of, I don't know if this is as good as the pencil and paper. The people that I've talked to have said, like, I've gone back to pencil and paper because I think I get better data. The one point before I forget, the funniest thing I think is that throughout the manual, Dr. Gordon kept saying, local norms are better. Local norms are better. Local norms are better. And he never actually talks to you about how to develop local norms. and so it's really easy with Excel. So that's one of the things is how do you, it's a formula. So as long as you have all of your data in there, it's literally one of the prefab %rank.exe. You use that as the formula and you go clicky and then all I have to do is hit the convert to percent, and it goes from the 2-digit to percentile. It's amazing how easy it is with a barely known function in Excel. The only time consuming thing it's going to be is just simply data entering the raw scores. And then if you want to do your own item difficulty and discrimination, that's where you start typing a lot of ones and zeros to get that to happen. But I think if more teachers that were interested in how these tests function started doing that, we could start building quite a bit more, a wealth of data on are these tests functioning? Is it still almost 50 years later functioning as advertised? Or
Yeah, and I think the item difficulty, beyond just someone taking a aptitude test, but actually having a taxonomy, it's so helpful for curriculum design, just at a practical level, knowing, okay, I want to start the student on the piano or the guitar or whatever, and I'm pretty safe if I start my curriculum with these kinds of patterns in the beginning. It's going to help a lot of people feel, some success. And I know, if someone's not being challenged enough, I can throw these extra patterns at them to get them to feed off them a little bit. But I specifically am interested in, for my own curriculum design, having a very, high confidence level in what the easy patterns are, to make sure people are getting started with, a really strong feeling of success on their instrument. I remember I took out a copy of in British Columbia at University of British Columbia, UBC. They just had a copy of Gordon's tonal taxonomy book, and I was like, "What?" I was not expecting it at all, and just glancing through that and trying to. It's hard to line it up with your own experience when you're only teaching 30 kids a week or something. It's not enough kids, but you start noticing like some of these I definitely agree with. In terms of where he's placed them, and then there'd be other ones where, I don't know, I have some suspicions about this one being easy or this one being hard, because sometimes you just see students crush some of the hard ones all the time. But I find that like really fascinating. If there's any updates on
and
on
I would
that
hear
whole
Gordon
thing.
often say, because a lot of my general music colleagues that are using his register books, some of those patterns right off the bat are really hard to sing. And I would, Ed would come back and say, remember, the research was what was easy to audiate, moderately difficult to audiate, and difficult to audiate. It wasn't anything about how to perform.
Yeah, and this is the problem basically I think people have with curriculum design. I see this on piano and guitar specifically, because there are things that are easy to audiate, may not be easy to conceptually lay out on the instrument in a rational way, and also mirroring notation, whether you're going to do some notational audiation or decoding. What's easy for audiation or decoding or instrumental association, they're not all the same. Some things that are easy to audiate are not easy to put on the guitar in a certain key if you're using open string. Some things that are easy to put on the guitar are actually hard to audiate. Some patterns are hard to audiate. And that's where I think, having an awareness of, okay, this is easy to play on the guitar and easy to audiate. Therefore, it should probably just be right off the bat in the curriculum, and making those kinds of decisions. And that's why I think curriculum design can get so out of hand so fast, because those are pretty deep questions, you know, for a teacher to contemplate.
So because you know, I'm a wind player. I'm a sax player, woodwind doubler. The question I've had is, does it make sense to start in major and minor, or is Dorian and Mixolydian a better place to start? What do you think?
Just in terms of Dorian and Mixolydian being better to start in terms of exposing students to it earlier, or for some other reason?
What they're hearing, what we're listening to, what's in the musical culture surrounding them, it really seems like Dorian and Mixolydian are more familiar than major and minor.
Yeah, I mean, I think depending on someone's listening vocabulary, that can certainly be true. There's Mixolydian, it's so easily soaked up by a lot of students that I have that have a large like rock background or whatever, and easier than I would say harmonic minor for a lot of those kids. They hear the changes in Mixolydian, you know, they hear the subtonic and they hear that more than they'd hear a 5-chord in harmonic minor if they're not getting exposed to those sounds a lot. And again, I mean, that's a whole nother, you know, consideration. Which tonalities do you bring in and when? Eric and I have talked a lot about that ourselves, or, you know, Eric's observation too. And I've grown to agree with him that the 4-chord is in a lot of cases harder for many students to audiate than 505 in major and minor. And I've been exploring recently with the way Eric and I are doing, just teaching the identification and audiation of functions. I've been exploring just teaching the identification of 505 before 4, because there's something about it. It just stands out for most students. And it's like, well, that's obviously not the 5-chord, it's the 505. And sometimes the 4-chord throws people off more. It seems to require more exposure and mastery to kind of get to an acceptable level of performance. And yeah, I mean, there's so many ways curriculums can unfold.
Yeah.
Based on difficulty levels.
Terry, I got another question.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
Just trigger a thought. You know, that's one of the things in that Dick Grunow and Chris Cesara have made a conscious decision in the revision to jump right in the instrumental series. You know, the recorder book is done. The wind, brass, percussion book is hopefully coming soon. The string book is going to be next. But when they first started toying with revisions to the recorder book, they were asking those of us who were kind of using it, going outside of Gordon's rhythm taxonomy and including rest patterns kind of right up front, and knowing that, okay, you know, Heather Schultz's MLT police, like, you know, are you going to only get a warning, or are you going to actually get a citation, or are the MLT police going to arrest you? Well, from a practical standpoint, any beginning instrumental music, band music that I'm you know, starting, because that's my gig. I'm fortunate now, after 20 plus years, I have 2 music learning theory based beginning band teachers as my feeder. So we are working to try to develop a 4th grade, 5th grade, 1st year, 2nd year MLT based curriculum. And I'm in the weird that then the teachers after me, I need to, you know, refocus the kids to because it's all traditional band, B-flat band kind of stuff. But that question is, you know, why rest patterns so soon? Well, the kids need to have them as familiar patterns. As soon as you pass out any kind of beginning band music, it's going to have rests.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, that's where the practical considerations can sometimes override, you know, the theoretical layout of what should come first. Some things are just, and I've noticed this with certain patterns, certain tonal patterns in isolation that seem hard to audiate when they're put in the context of a song and and have a familiar song with a very specific rhythm that goes along with them, some students don't struggle with those patterns like at all. And it's an interesting, observation, because we try to separate, tonal patterns from rhythm patterns, but in some circumstances, the whole, whatever you want to call it, gestalt is not really that bad.
Well, and I think that's too sometimes where we in music learning theory get a bad rap, because we spend so much time talking about these patterns that when we're presenting this to other people, we have to constantly go back and remind them it's whole part whole. We are creating a context, and then we are trying to give them a vocabulary of these patterns that then hopefully should make putting it back in the greater whole much more meaningful. I know that at the last Gimel conference, I ended up having a lovely dinner with the Erics, Bluestein and Rasmussen, and we got talking about, my analogy is not as complete, but it suddenly hit me of, for my 4 years going back and teaching elementary, it's such a big deal for our kindergartners when they finally have 100 sight words. It's like, oh yeah, patterns are just sight words. It's giving kids enough vocabulary that when they see it in notation, their musicianship takes over, and then they can fill in the context of the missing bits, the unfamiliar bits. Like, oh.
Yeah. Yeah. And Eric and I have been talking about that lately in terms of decoding. And I think that, not to derail everything, and we haven't even released the podcast episode about this, but I personally feel that some amount of decoding for someone who wants to be an advanced musician is absolutely necessary to learn at some point. We can't assume that everyone's just going to memorize tonal patterns for everything. But the question is, do you have enough of that tonal content? So like you said, the musicianship takes over and is the primary driver of what's going on. Because if you have some ability to generalize and you have enough patterns, some decoding concepts just fill in the cracks. And
my band also just did it to me on Friday. Sorry, we're recording this on a Sunday. I was running all the pieces. We're about 5 weeks away from our concert, so we're running down the tunes, and they played the melody. They didn't play the coda, they played the melody. It's like, wait, what are you doing? So we went back to the rehearsal number, and they did it again. And it wasn't like one kid, it was like the band. And then it crashed and burned, because then there was a couple of kids who were like, no, this is the ending. And so after they did it the third time, I'm like, all right, the MLT police are going to slap me on the hands, like, stop playing what you're audiating, play what the guy wrote. And I had to make them sing it, and they're like this collective group of 40 kids going, oh yeah, that's right, it is different.
That's great.
Yeah, for sure.
That's great.
Eric, I stepped. You were going to ask a question a bit on, and I stepped on you. Do you remember what you were going to ask?
No, you didn't step on, because it's something I've been told. In the PMMA, what percentage of those items are not like function patterns?
Ooh. I don't know.
Because there's da-da-dee-da-da, definitely not a function pattern. And it's some of them, and then some are pretty vague function-wise.
Wait, I can't find my manual, Eric. I can't find my manual. It's like the end of the world.
You officially, pretty soon you're going to find out your doctorate doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah. Oh, wait, here it is.
That's the next step.
Do you know what the worst part of this was having to go through the original manual and the current manual and try to figure out what he changed?
Yeah.
And so...
Oh, I would really like to know that.
Do you want to know what the answer is?
Yeah.
So as part of this, we basically randomly, Dr. Unfola picked a chapter at random, and so I went word by word, and for the most part, there could be some other little things that snuck by. It was the addition of "and intermediate measures of music audiation" in any sentence that it was called for. So that the chapter that we picked was like the original manual, that's sitting at the UB library. Well, it's actually like sitting behind me, because someday it should go back. But it was like the primary measures of music audiation, blah, 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 blah. And now in the updated manual, it's the primary measures and intermediate measures of music audiation. I did catch him in two things. As I'm looking at the patterns, I've not forgotten your question, but I'm visual in that way. Tonal. There we go. Thing number one that I caught him in is, that's the descriptive paragraph of that sample. At one point I could recite that paragraph from memory, and said that the data was collected in October. And what I found interesting is he had some follow-up research that was published in I believe, Journal of Research in Music Education. And he was talking about how he'd gone back a year later and did retested the kids that were still of the same age. Mm-hmm. So, the first graders, second graders, and third graders, because they were kindergarten first and second when he did the original sample. So those kids took the final pilot design of the PMMA to establish the norms. Then they did the retest 2 weeks later, and then a year later they did it again. And the way that it was in the published article was apparently he collected his data in the spring. So I wonder at what point, and that is the only other thing that I noted that stuck out that was changed, is in the original manual, he said, it was collected in the year, but didn't state the month. And then in the current version that's got the PMMA and IMMA together, that's where it states. And the other fun one I found is apparently there's one number, and of course I forget which test item it is for which grade, that was the only spot that my numbers and his numbers were polar opposites. But the number that I found was a transposition of what's reported in the manual. So I'm wondering, and I would have to go back in my dissertation to look up which item it is, but it's almost like there was a typo. Yeah. Because, everything was hand typed. So I do know that when you look at how he designed the test, he kept trying to design, he tried to create and keep an order of items, so there was a resting tone getting reinforced throughout. So all of the items
and a singular resting tone.
Correct. So that the items themselves were at least creating the resting tone rather than kind of a tonality. He was doing his best. Mm-hmm. And I believe the tonal patterns were all of the easy patterns in major and minor. And that was it. Anything else was rejected. Rhythm patterns, he had to use the easy patterns in... I think he had to utilize a couple of other meters to get enough. But that's I think the primary difference. See, now you're making me go back from my memory. It was only easy patterns from his taxonomies used in the PMMA, and then IMMA were, like I said, the items that were rejected as being too difficult got used.
So all in all, you would recommend that just for the same purpose as the PMMA was used for all these years, that it does a valid job today for teachers who would use the information in the way that Gordon would like.
Yes. Yes, I would. I think that's a very important caveat. Part of my lit review was I just did a search for any study that used PMMA, and oh my goodness, there was well over 100 different studies, and so I rather than reporting on each and every one, I reported general categories, how these studies were used, and there are some wacky ways that PMMA were getting used. I'm not going to say they're inappropriate, but if you caught me not in a formal, they're just. What? I think the difficulty and discrimination question makes me wonder whether or not we can make valid conclusions with using PMMA. I think from the report of my teachers the kindergarten and talking to other practitioners about how they use PMMA. I happened to be on one of our Gimel chats, and it was the authors of the Q&A for MLT for general music, and some folks were asking about PMMA, and I happened to be at our local library entering in ones and zeros while I was listening, and said, like, Bacon, we know you're here, this is what you're researching, come on. And the conclusion of kind of the conversation was, kindergarten, you almost have to treat it like a practice experience in how to take the test from a public school.
Yeah, I got right around 50% valid tests, with 2 other people in the room when I did kindergarten. And this kindergarten's from a 100% Title I school. Okay. And real immature crowd generally. But I would get half of them to give me a good score. The other ones, one of the things they love to do is they hear a pattern and they circle. they don't wait for that's where the 2 bunnies.
Yep, the 2 stuffies come in handy.
Yeah.
I think also, from my conclusions, with at least the students from the teachers, Gimel members, theoretically teaching using Gordon's ideas, PMMA was too easy for 2nd and 3rd graders. So when it comes down to it, that just leaves 1st grade. So I think that, there's so many of those questions that I have following this journey with PMMA. Like, somebody needs to do it with IMMA. And if I was, into... I could almost feel my knuckle, like the pain that I had for a year of my Bluetooth number pad add onto my laptop of typing ones and zeros.
Yeah, I've got a special keyboard right here that can do, up, down, up, down, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. And your fingers just know to hit 0 when you say up and it's a down, and you just go that. Turn a page. And you do that. Mine was one of the two of the 100 maybe you looked at, because I did PMMA and how that related to early childhood experiences before they were born up till 2-3 years, what their lives were like, and take that survey data and and look at it in terms of what scores came out, and kids with really high rhythm aptitude, their parents are like pregnant and in the dance studio. Their sister owned a music hall. It's like the kids are off the scale. It's really curious to see those relationships. And the other one, I was looking at coordination, doing some work of who's the Michigan lady that does coordination work? Phyllis Weichert.
Phil Weichert, yes.
Yeah. So, yeah. So one of the things I've been chewing hard on the last 4 or 5 years is tonal patterns, say, in just say tonic, are audiated differently than tonic, played simultaneously. There's just no doubt in my mind that they're audiated differently. And would it seem improper to try to set up tonality better, like he does for HIRR? Like, just listen, here's your tonality, now answer these questions. And then there's some of the functions that are in that tonal pattern repertoire that are kind of vague. They don't necessarily tell me whether it's a dominant pattern or whatever.
Well, and I think that goes to one of the the criticisms of these tests historically is, are they actually a test of music aptitude, or is it merely an aural perception test? And what's interesting is that there was this wealth of people, seemingly, that were looking at music aptitude until Gordon. And then Gordoned, and everybody seemed to just stop.
Fizzle out, yeah.
And I do know that there's some tests being developed by Kai Karma. I have attempted to read those articles numerous times. I need somebody way smarter than me to get some sock puppets out and try to explain to me what his test design is. Meaning no disrespect. I'm just not getting it as a test of music aptitude, music potential. And one of the things I also, this journey has really hit home is that, Gordon throughout his writings reminds us that every music aptitude test to some degree is a music achievement test. And all music achievement tests, to some degree, are a music aptitude test. In all his historical criticisms, going back, was looking. It's like, this is very obviously in our Gordon's understanding now. That was an achievement test. I forget which one it was that, like, if the kids couldn't read music notation, they couldn't take the test. That's definitely a music achievement test. So, those nagging last, when the sleep deprivation was hitting as you're writing the last bits of that dissertation, going, so I've done all this, but is this really a test of music potential? And so what is music potential? And all the ponderings that as part of Gordon's research career and those of us who have tried to continue his work and further his work, I think it truly goes in the spirit of I know that you've seen the Italian Gimel organization's video that Andrea did, and I couldn't help but quote that because I think that ending is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, heard Ed say, which is the hope that we take his work and further it. That music learning theory is just, it's done. He's dead. This is it. It shall never be changed. Yeah. And so I think that since music aptitude is such a core tenet that every child is born with the potential to be musical, it's such a core tenet of music learning theory. I think we need to continue to question, well, are his tests the best that we can do today?
Yeah. Well, my cheap version of so there's Audi M melody, Audi R rhythm. Well, my Audi H, it's not public. I can't use that name yet. It works with a fair number of 2.5-year-olds, and to get that information that early means a whole hell of a lot when you've got that many more years, 4, 5, 6 years of boosting what they've got, or helping fill in what they haven't. But I'm finding out that some of my kids just don't improve on that at all. Just answer yes. Does Mary had a little M end here? Or does it end here? It's like, yes, it ends there. No, because that's the dominant chord. And so, but they can audiate full chords. They're not audiating patterns yet. They don't sing patterns yet. Kids aren't ready to sing patterns yet, but they're ready to tell you yes and no. That's no. Can't end there.
Yeah, in my experience with guiding kids that are slightly older, kind of in the 6 to 10 range, in terms of having students, ask, guiding them to recognize full, harmonic gestalts or chords instead of tonal patterns. My experience is that some of the kids rapidly can learn how to hear like 4 or 5 functions and point them out in major and minor. And they seem to just have it within, if you do it right, within the first lesson or two, just that ability to identify, not necessarily the ability to like improvise over those functions or whatever yet. But then other students, they're immediately stuck once they hit the third function. And it doesn't seem to, you can train it, and maybe if these students did an absurd volume of training on their own or whatever, we don't really know the answer. Maybe because there is some research in other fields where high dosage of training is actually required to create perceptual shifts. So like 20 trials a day might not be enough. You might need like 300 trials a day before something actually changes, and it might need to happen in a small time window. You can't just do 300 trials over the course of a week. And so we don't really know that. So because I don't have kids that will cooperate with doing 300 trials of, is this chord, is this that chord? But a lot of people, if you get a musician who comes to you and they're like, I just want to be the best musician I can be, and I want to learn how to hear harmonic functions, I'm willing to do that. Is that an aptitude thing? Like, do they already have the aptitude? And when they come to me at 17 and they say, I want to be the best, jazz guitar player I can be, and we don't know what to tell them yet. I mean, all I know is, generally do this kind of stuff and practice lots, and that seems to be better than not doing it. But I have found the same thing as Eric, that at least at the dosages we're training people at, there does seem to be potentially maybe this harmonic aptitude stabilizes way earlier than we think it does, because we always kind of lump tonal and harmonic stuff together. And like you said, rhythm aptitude may stabilize, grade 2, possibly, but so earlier than the standard. But I have a feeling based off of what I've seen so far and from talking to Eric that harmonic aptitude might itself stabilize way earlier than someone's tonal aptitude. But it'd be cool to see some more research. It's fascinating. Who was the sorry, Terry, was it Kai Karma who's developing these alternative, like non-MLT, non-Gordon aptitude tests? Are they tonal based tests, or are they rhythm based, or is it both? Or
I would have to go back and I'd have to look it up and of course, I'm having to read translations of what he published, and I'd struggle to give you the elevator pitch description of what it is. That's fair enough. I can say it's a very different idea of what a music aptitude assessment is.
Mm-hmm. Which is I think I'm net encouraging towards someone else who has maybe not the lens of MLT, trying to develop their own things and seeing what happens. Because maybe we use some kind of Gordon's aptitude test and that person's test and see if there's a correlation between them, or if they're actually just measuring things that are, that person's test is just measuring aural perception, and we could just, do similar training by just listening to different car engine, revving to train that. But no, I think that's great. I think that's a net positive for the aptitude, testing. And I think that's community.
What you said. So one of my recommendations is potentially I found what I found because everybody that I was using, to some degree, is dedicated to furthering the work of Edwin Gordon. What might I find if I was using general music practitioners that, were Kodai specialists or Orff specialists or just eclectic Delcros? Would similar findings happen? I don't know.
I mean, interesting thought on that topic. So when Gordon first developed these tests, there was no Gimel, teacher base administering these techniques at large. I mean, obviously kids were singing and moving and dancing, but the fact that you're finding similar results aptitude wise in norms with teachers who are explicitly driving this stuff, I think that's interesting in some sense. Because I think a lot of us would expect to see maybe the norms progressing towards like higher aptitude subtly in across these ranges.
And actually what was interesting is everybody's money that the informal, like, I bet you're gonna find was all on rhythm aptitude was gonna be lower. Like everything was gonna get the raw scores were gonna get smushed lower. And no. But again, it comes back to the difficulty discrimination. How much of that did it play a role into the norms tables just basically being very, very, very close to similar to the 44-year-old ones that
Yeah.
exist.
Well, I think it's fantastic we have replication at a larger scale of what Gordon did. The fact that because we see this all the time in all kinds of research, nutrition research, exercise research. Someone does one study and it's not enough to make a scientific consensus on whether what the findings were valid or not. And we need a pool of studies that kind of point our direction, point our arrows in one direction and say, okay, this is probably something's going on here. Because one study can, there can be confounders, and the fact that Gordon maybe was throwing certain things out of his studies, and the same thing happens in nutrition research. People just throw. We had a sample size of 40 people and 15 of them didn't comply. So we just tossed that out. And then if you read why they didn't comply, like one of the groups was just asked to be doing something that was insane and not sustainable. And then the study is kind of invalid in the sense that, okay, if you follow this insane practice, you could get results, but 15 out of 40 people won't follow it. Maybe that's an alarm bell that this is not a good technique to use in general, whether or not the findings, point towards something. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's those practical considerations that was one of the more fun and challenging parts of the dissertation to do was I was struggling with it. And finally, one of my friends and part of my committee just said, look, it's because we've just spent years and years telling you don't have an opinion, and you finally get to the part of the dissertation where you get to have an opinion. And at my heart, I'm a public school teacher. It's what I've spent my career doing. In my past life, when I was a performer, most of my bread and butter in performing was doing school residencies, in school assemblies before I became a full-time teacher. And at the end of the day, I wanted to be practical. What are the practical things we can do? Well, the practical things we can do is not say same and different, say same and not the same. Use some kind of preparation so that the kids understand what they mean by different. I think one of the teachers talked about they put they've got a red circle and a red triangle and a blue circle and a blue triangle. Are they same and different? And talk about how they're the same. How they,
that is a problem with teaching students concepts or vocabulary, is we think we're teaching the concept we have in mind, but we're not ruling out stipulations and misrules. So the student is making a perfectly valid, logical deduction based off of how we've presented that information. And I think we just assume that a kindergarten kid or a kid in grade 1 knows what different means, and is not only knows what different means, but is able to apply it just on a whim. Okay, tell me if this is the same or different, and we should check if that's the case.
And so doing that even though Gordon in the manual said you shouldn't have to do that, you probably should do that so that there's some kind of
maybe you shouldn't have to do that for someone who grows up in a very vocabulary driven household with parents who are doing activities with kids that would make them have mastery of that skill by the time they're in kindergarten. I have no doubt that maybe Gordon's kids wouldn't have a problem with that. He just seemed very well off with words and had a nice, way about him. But yeah, I've seen that with a lot of teachers. Teachers assume kids know what left and right is.
Right.
And they discover that kids don't. I mean, have fun teaching guitar or piano without sorting that out.
Oh.
But they discover that kids don't know what left and right is, and they don't engage in a process to correct the confusion in a very dependable way. It's kind of just marches on.
In my 3 years experience in doing marching band, I can tell you that high school students struggle with which one's the right and which one's the left.
Yeah. I think your example with the square and the circle and the different, one color of each is just textbook.
Yeah, and that's I forget who suggested that, so I can't give them credit. That might have even been Dr. Bolton, because I know that in her dissertation she did some preparation before administering PMMA in her research. But simple, for me, anytime I ever gave IMMA, because I was fortunate, my general music room did not have chairs. Did not have desks, had carpet. So I had 30 clipboards all ready with the test. And then the kids could, I had them spread out. They could lay down. They could be comfortable.
They love laying on the floor taking the test. They move when they're on the floor. That's the other thing. You're allowed to move. I mean, you're not rolling over other kids, but...
No. But it gives them more freedom rather than, okay, kids, it's time for yet another assessment, standardized assessment.
Yeah, well, one of the most important things about giving the PMMA is the motivation piece. You know, that it's very strongly said, but there's no special words they says to say. It's like, you know, I tell the kids, I want to be a better teacher. Will you help me be a better teacher? You're going to help me be able to teach you better if you do this for me. And I just want you to, I want to thank you for helping me become a better teacher, because you're going to do this, you know, for me. And, you know, and I think the kids, that's my shtick for it. You know, first, second grade, kindergarten.
Well, I can tell you, you know, like I said, my experience is IMMA, and when I was administering IMMA, I was trying to, okay, what is a kid-friendly way of explaining this test? And so I settled on, hey, our brains all process music differently, and I'm giving you this test. And I give them some vocal examples of what they're going to experience as part of preparing them for when the back-to-back weeks that I would do the tonal test and the rhythm test. And up to that point, because third grade in our district was, instrument families, so all leading up to, okay, and in fourth grade, you get to start your instrument. And so I talk about, there are some kids who struggle to buzz. I was one of those kids. It's why I play the saxophone. There are other kids who may have something physical about, struggling with that. And I would do different things leading up to this part where I said, okay, now this test is going to be one other piece of information I'm going to collect. And I want to know, are you somebody for whom rhythm is really, really easy? The way your brain processes music, rhythm might be your thing. Or maybe it's not. So if you want to be a percussionist and your brain doesn't rhythm really well, are you going to be really successful on percussion? And the kid's like, yeah, no. Or there's certain instruments where it's an advantage to maybe be stronger totally than other instruments. And my job is to look at you, think about what your interest is, and then take this information and try to find instruments that you have the best chance of being successful on. So please take it seriously, because it's just one more piece of information that I can use to help you be a better musician, fulfill a dream of playing an instrument.
Yeah. I mean, one simple thing that I've noticed is that students that seem to have a lower aptitude, and if you're a teacher, if you're a piano teacher, a guitar teacher, one-on-one teacher or whatever, I find that they don't like playing along with me at the same time early on as much, because if I have just iron solid rhythm, it's basically like them playing with a metronome, and it's rough until they've developed a certain level of achievement. And so I've learned to, even with students I'm not giving an aptitude test to, I can tell early on within the first few months if they struggle with rhythm. I might not push that as hard, the playing with me, but if someone is really solid rhythmically, they seem to love it. They love playing at the same time as me. They love being accompanied. And obviously you want to expose everyone to this, but I think knowing these things, it allows you to tweak and push on things and bring things out more and back off on things, or just make them easier, quite frankly, when someone struggles with it. Because I think for a lot of students, if they're not getting a high success rate early on in lessons, instrumental lessons specifically, it's hard for them to just develop the motivation to keep pushing forward with it. Because, no one really likes... I don't think most people are naturally going to jump into a hobby and just get clobbered by it and not experience success and want to continue with it. And so if we know how to back off and make the success rate higher for somebody, or we have repertoire and this student has great tonal aptitude, questionable rhythm achievement aptitude right now, I'm gonna, maybe give them songs that are more based off of microbeats instrumentally. But maybe I have songs that have more microbeats, but get adventurous tonally a little bit, and they can handle that. And so knowing someone's makeup, you can kind of guide them in your menu choice of repertoire or activities a little bit. And it's cool once you start having, I don't know the term for this, like a baseball card for somebody, strong tonal, strong rhythm, strong tonal, weaker rhythm. You have certain pieces of repertoire that are like your go-tos for those situations. Because I find sometimes if someone's tonal aptitude is high and their rhythm aptitude is low, you don't just want to give them super, super simple songs because it's not tickling their tonal thing. And so you need something for that situation, and you need something for the opposite situation too, where someone's rhythm aptitude is just cooking, but tonally, they're not ready for certain harmonic ideas or certain, and I think that's for me like the most practical part of all of this is it influences how I'm dispersing the curriculum. And when you're a one-on-one teacher, you have absurd control over this because you don't have to try to make it work in a group. But I think a lot of that has been part of why I'm successful as a one-on-one teacher, is just augmenting the difficulty level so that someone's actually making music in the lesson and feeling like a command over whatever patterns they're working with or whatever they're working with. Maybe that's like the positive side of, using the tests rather than the filtration system for higher aptitude students.
Right. And ultimately, I believe that's the primary purpose of the tests, is to improve individualized instruction for every student. And that's why we do it. Yes, one of the other purposes is to identify students on the high end that might not want to involve themselves in musical activity. But at the end of the day, purpose number one is to improve instruction. And as was beaten into my head by all these amazing teachers in measurement and evaluation I've had in my career, the ultimate purpose of an assessment tool is to see if what you taught the kids actually stuck. It's more of information rather than giving grades.
Sure.
So,
which I mean that should have been the intention with a test to begin with. I always had this idea of tests where, especially in subjects like math, where the tests are just so cut and dry because with the way the questions are typically answered. I never liked the idea of a test being given. That's your score. Okay, you're at 86. So let's move on. The test in my mind is like a feedback mechanism for how well the curriculum and the teaching is working and all of that. And in my mind, if a student wants to take the test like 8 times and keep getting a better grade, I don't really understand the philosophical position in not allowing them to do that. Because if it's about achieving more and they want to study more and take the test again and achieve a higher grade, why would we not allow that? And I think the similar thing happens musically when we ask students to learn patterns, or a lot of band teachers are trying to involve some form of testing in their lessons by learning scales and taking scale tests in my band teacher never really did that, and looking back I think it was genius that he didn't, because in a lot of ways perhaps I'm not against learning scales, but the whole testing mindset is very odd in the sense of tests being kind of a way of ranking people.
It's you make me giggle because it's one of my favorite Grunoisms. Man, if those kids can play all major scales, they can play one really lame tune in all major keys.
Yeah, this is why I often go against the advice in the jazz community of learn everything in all keys. Maybe work with like a few keys and learn your licks in a few keys, but is it really worth your time in the beginning stage to take everything through all keys, or just learn more content? I'd rather have someone do that at a younger age, because like you said, you can play a lot of lame folk songs in all keyities. I don't think a lot of people are really fired up by that.
But I can tell you though that and that's been exciting this year. This is the first time, like I said, in my career, I've had students that were started this way. Before I left the high school, my shtick in it felt like in MLT world was, hey, I'm the high school band director trying to like figure out ways to do this backwards. I've got kids with great executive skills that can't audiate hot cross buns, and so it's the explosions in my 5th graders, 2nd year players' brains as they're like playing different exercises or different things. Oh, that's like Mary Had a Little Lamb, but it's an F-do. And then they'll like start figuring out Mary Had a Little Lamb. And that I think is where some of that power is of when we read those charts on audiation and all the different types and stages and all that. Well, the kids are living that of, oh, I recognize that pattern in my audiation. Oh, it's just the buttons I have to push. And I know that's one of the things that the kids are really struggling is, what do you mean? No, C is always do and D is like always re. I'm like, no. Do, re, mi is a job, right? It's do, re, mi, or it could be do, re, mi, right? They're different.
and I think to explain that to someone, it's really the same situation with the colored circles and triangles, the blue and red of each, explaining, properly inductively teaching a student that do can move around to different keyalities. It's really the same educational obstacle as, sorting those other things out. Eric's brought this up a few times, but, I think it can be challenging for people. Like when I was 12 or 13 and I got a saxophone, I could immediately improvise. There was no delay. Like I had the readiness, like the full readiness for the instrument, at that point. I was already noodling with the piano a little bit before that, but it is interesting for me to imagine someone starting an instrument and not having that kind of audiation foundation, underneath it.
I'll raise my hand to that. It's been one of the biggest challenges of being a saxophone player is I was never encouraged to improvise. So then all of a sudden I'm showing up at the Eastman School of Music and I got a real pretty sound and I got really fast fingers. But if you ask me to improvise over hot cross buns, what? Being an MLT based teacher has improved my improvisation skills, but I am, Chris Azera often says, what are the 2 4-letter words associated with jazz or associated with improvisation? Jazz and fear, right? And
yeah. Oh, and I think that's such a good point. I even when I joined the high school jazz band, there was virtually no one that wanted to improvise, and I always improvised. And it wasn't a graded. It was a full high school jazz band. So from grade 8 theoretically to grade 12, but typically a grade 8 wouldn't be in it. I was in it right away, and I was pretty much the only kid that would improvise. And I didn't know what scales went with what. It didn't matter. I just heard melodies. And for a lot of other people that were trying to improvise, it was very fear based. And people would ask me, like, what are you doing? Like, I don't know, just it's like whistling with a saxophone in your hand. But yeah, I think Eric's point that it can be, you have to be very careful when you're a teacher and a lot of these things came easy to you. You can't just assume that it's going to be like that because we have that bias. Well, I get it. So why, why wouldn't they just get it right away? And we almost start trying to give, I think it's very tempting and easy to do, but we start giving students or pushing students in the direction of the things that we are challenged on because we think that that's what everyone, needs. And I think that's where these tests can come in handy. And I think at some point, once you've taught enough with MLT operating, online in your mind, you start noticing like, okay, like this person struggles with rhythm. Like there's really no point in me, dragging them through the mud here. I need to support them and help them and make this fun for them.
Yeah. And I think I became a much better instrumental teacher, especially as a high school band director, through my experience in teaching early childhood. Because I could start to recognize in my freshmen, sophomores, juniors, they were going through preparatory audiation. They were not ready to do what I was asking them to do, but their challenge was their chronological age was that of 14, 15, 16-year-olds, but their musical age was that of 2, 3, and 4-year-olds. And so it really was living that, chronological age is not necessarily musical age. And so we need to find effective ways to speak musically, interact musically, play musically with those older students that might not yet have had the opportunity to start to audiate.
I really resonate with that because as I'm an online guitar teacher, so it's basically teenagers, right? And many of them I started with this new student. I haven't given him an aptitude test, but it's clearly off the charts tonally. And he just soaks up everything I give him, and I do a lot of games with him. Is this the same as that? Just kind of tucked in there, thrown in there. He's just always just bang on. Like I'm pretty sure his tonal audiation is higher than mine. But then there's other students where they're at that pre-audiation level. They can't sing a resting tone, or they couldn't find a resting tone on an instrument, let alone sing it. Like we'll just take singing out of the equation and just say, play this C on your piano. Is that the resting tone, after enough guidance and stuff like that? And it can be challenging, I think, for some people for teachers especially, where you need to find ways of teaching them the instrument because they're coming to you for instrumental lessons. So that's what they want. They want to learn to play guitar. And in their mind, I always phrase it as music lessons, not guitar lessons. Here's your link for music lessons with Beau, not guitar lessons. So I try to plant that in from the beginning. But some students, they're not thinking about all this stuff, MLT, whatever. They're like, oh, I just want to learn to play guitar. And they come see a guitar teacher and they want to start with chords or whatever. And they can't, the prep audiation stuff of just singing like 3 do re mi in major. Like they don't have that, and that's why they can't improvise on hot cross buns, because that foundation isn't there. And it can take time with these students to lay that, not that they can't do it, because I've seen people do it, but it is a bit of a balancing act, making sure you're giving them activities that they can chew on, but they're also growing, in some way. And yeah, I think for teenagers, I think this can be specifically challenging because a lot of the things that we have to get them to do to grow their audiation, a lot of 17-year-old kids don't want to do it. A lot of 17-year-old boys learning guitar don't want to sing one-on-one in a room with a guitar teacher and move and dance, And so I'm sure you've experienced all this yourself.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was all, trying to get my high school band to sing. I always, there's at least enough wacky pieces out there in wind band literature. I just made it part of my mission to do something weird and wacky every year. And so singing in band seemed almost normal compared to playing, I don't know, this aleatoric piece that the saxophone section is all doubling on crystal glasses and doing the woo. The other thing that I also had as an advantage is I would guilt my students in, because my school district is, one of our distinguished alumni is Renee Fleming. So I could say, we can sing in band. Like we have a strong history of choral music, and one of the greatest operatic sopranos right now is is an alum. She wore the orange and black of the district, just like all you are doing. So yeah, let's sing, kids. But I learned very quickly that you don't start singing in band until after the drop ad date.
Sorry, after the
drop ad date.
Oh yeah.
So it was a lot of rhythm work in those first couple of weeks, and then the other secret I found, and I shouldn't say this because I'm giving away one of my my regular workshop things, is I just never asked my kids to sing. Hey, could we chant through this? Here we go, da, da, da. and so I would say chant it. We were just chanting on pitch. I just never used the S word, and found more often that because I spent so much time singing myself in modeling, and that, I didn't use the word sing, they were willing to take that chance with me. And it also, very, very, I need to give credit to my colleague. I wasn't the only band director. There were 2 of us. And he had such a masterful way of creating learning environment, a positive learning environment where kids felt okay making a mistake, where mistakes weren't going to get you in trouble. Usually good humor if the teacher makes the mistake, the student makes the mistake. It's like, let me try that again kind of attitude. And yeah. I had that as a mentor. I had that as an office mate for 17 years. And so our kids actually joked at one point, somebody noticed that we look exactly like, the 2 old guy Muppets, Statler and Waldorf. I was the tall one. My colleague was, the spitting image of the shorter one. So they put a picture and then added a beard to the tall one and started putting that up around the band room. we were the two living embodiment, Muppets of the room. But having that kind of environment took years to get there. But the kids were, you would see the upperclassmen goes, oh yeah, that's just welcome to band. Yep, you roll with it. It's bacon being weird. Is it a day that ends with modeling?
Yeah. Modeling mistakes and even just modeling singing and not pushing singing early on with people that are clearly in the prep audition levels is I think a great idea. I've been very successful with students who don't have any interest in singing and won't really sing in class. And if you follow the stages of audition, you make sure you're putting resting tones in their mind before you give them patterns. A lot of it works anyway. It's not, I think a lot of people forget that like singing is an insane tool for building someone's audition, but there's not any reason why they absolutely have to do it. Like even when I was learning and I, developed audition, I sang a bit in school and stuff like that, but I actually just listened to my brother playing piano mostly. And I watched him play piano very closely. I remember being very interested in that. And I use singing as a tool, but I've had great success with students where you can get them quite far without pushing the singing super, super hard. And a lot of people will just naturally start singing once they see their teacher singing a lot and, they're engaging with music. It just seems to be almost like a natural byproduct, but that S word can turn some students off for sure. Yeah.
This is really great stuff. For the second half of this episode, I'd like to get into HIRR. We got to dive deep into these things. It's so good. We had Ron Malanga on, and that's not out yet, but we just went the sensitivity test part 2, balance. We took a deep dive into that, and I think it's important for us to think about these aptitude measures and how to use them. What's really behind the curtain.
Ron's kind of in the same situation as you are, Terry. He's teaching band and trying to make it MLT synergistic at some level.
But it's so great to have you on and hear the perspective of somebody who's done that extraordinary work it took to
thank you
to renorm.
Remember, Ed said don't do it. Local norms. Don't try to get a national sample. Should have listened. But great questions. This has been a great conversation, guys. Nice. Eric, I've known forever. Nice to meet you, Beau.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was great to meet you. I've always heard Eric speaks very, very highly of you. So I knew it would be a good conversation. If Eric's speaking highly of someone, that's usually someone I want to talk to.
He bought me Mexican. How can you not?
Oh, yeah.
Some of the best Mexican food I've ever had, that's for sure.
It's crazy.
Nice.
All right, man.
All right, guys.
Thank you.